looks pretty good. All right, I'm going to get us started today then. Kick it off this morning. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. I'll just want to welcome everyone to our third Reach Code webinar. As a reminder, this is our Newcomers series, and today we're focusing on cost effectiveness. So this is our agenda. We'll have our welcome and logistics, and then Misty's going to talk a little bit about cost effectiveness. And then we'll hear from Chris Reed from the city of San Luis Obispo and Greg Mahoney from Sacramento County about some of their experiences using cost effectiveness information in their research work. Then Misty's going to talk about the recipe for cost effectiveness study, what goes into it, what you need to know, what you need to do to put one together. Or not what you do, but what she does, really, to put that together, her team. And then cover a little bit about what studies are in progress for the 2022 code cycle. Then we'll have a few takeaways and some time for questions and answers before the end. And if there's time in there, we'll take a break too, but we're going to see how the time is going. So hopefully you all saw the message. We are recording today, and the recording of the presentation will be available online in the slide deck. And for logistics for today, if you have a question, as always, we have a pretty full agenda, but if someone says something and you're not understanding, you need an explanation or clarification, we try really hard not to throw the jargon out there, but occasionally we forget. So if you have a question, other people probably do too, please just raise your hand. And we'll try to keep our eyes out for that. And we'll pause for quick questions. But if you have a more involved question or something that can come later, then put your question in the chat and we'll have them at the end during the Q&A. As a reminder for today, this webinar series is for local government staff who are newcomers to Reach Codes to give them some background and technical information. We're not trying to tell you what Reach Code. Can everyone please mute yourself?
Thursday with Dr. Protz.
I'm going to mute it. There we go. Thank you. So we're not intending to tell anyone to adopt any particular Reach Code or discuss how to advocate to get one adopted. Today will be the most technical of our Reach Code webinars. But even at that, we're not going to go into a lot of the very technical stuff behind the scenes or talk about, what architects or folks need to do to comply with the Reach Code. So just wanted to put that disclaimer out there. And with that, I'm going to put a link in the chat. We do like to do a little poll at the beginning to find out who's in the room. So if everybody could please click on that and go to our Who's in the Room poll. And that will ask you just a couple things about what type of organization you represent and where you're from. And so just fill that out and we'll share the responses out here so that we can see what's what. Let me see. I'm going to give just a moment for a few more people to fill this out. And I see new people have been joining the call, so I'll put the link in the chat one more time for folks who can't access that. Please just take a second. All right, so I'm going to go through this. People can still put their answers in the chat. It looks like we've got 70% of folks are with local government, followed by other, and we have a number of consultants, regional or state government, and some utility and CCA folks. As for where people are from, got almost half from the Bay Area, and about a quarter from Southern California and from the Central Coast, with fortunately some other folks too. Glad to see folks from the Sierras and I guess that's other, and Northern California. So we've got a nice geographic representation. Thank you all for filling that out. So I'm going to just very quickly go over a couple key points from the two sessions we had earlier. Session 1, our introduction to REACH code, just talks about what is a REACH code. It's an amendment to the California Energy Code. That's what we're talking about here, Title 24, Part 6. And there are other approaches, other policy tools that have different requirements, different legal bases, and we'll talk about that a little bit on our next webinar session in April. And then a couple key requirements for REACH codes. They have to be at least as restrictive as the Energy Code. They do have to be cost effective, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today, is figuring out how you figure out whether they're cost effective. And then there's certain findings that have to be made for a REACH code. You have to find that the REACH code's needed for local climatic, geological, topographical, or environmental reasons, and that the finding needs to be based on something in the record. And then a REACH code must be approved by the California Energy Commission and filed with the Building Standards Commission to dot all the I's and cross all the T's. So it's not done when you pass it. And we talked about that. That's part of our REACH code process, which is what session 2 focused on. We talked about this beginning stage that we're at now. At the beginning, how looking at what are the goals and options, getting stakeholder input and public process, and getting technical information, how those 3 steps work together. And cost effectiveness studies are one of those key pieces for the technical information, of technical information to include in that. And all those 3 things feed together into your proposed REACH code. Then there's formal public process and adoption. And once it's been adopted, as I said, you're not done yet. There's still the state agency review and approval. And then actually what I think is the most important step, which is the implementation. So because once you pass it, that's great. You've got everything, the framework all there, but you have to actually implement it to see those changes that you want to see. So with that, I will pass this over to Misty, who's our cost effectiveness expert and has been working on this for decades, I think, and probably longer than she wants, but she will take us forward on this. So thanks.
It has indeed been decades. I won't say how many. Thank you very much, Karen. I think we got a little ahead of ourselves. Okay, so cost effectiveness is something that comes up quite frequently when we talk about REACH codes. And if you're not familiar with the terminology, it can be really confusing. So we're going to go ahead and start just at the very beginning here today with some basic terms and the metrics that we use. And I'm going to go ahead and go through those right now. So what is cost effectiveness? What do we mean when we say that? Basically, an investment or a requirement, a policy, whatever you're talking about is cost effective if the value of the benefits exceeds the value of the cost. Basically, it has to pay for itself over time. On the surface, it seems very, very straightforward. However, like all things, the actual results are really dependent on the inputs and assumptions that you use in the calculation, right? And so we'll go through some of those later. But for our purposes here, one of the things to remember is that when you're doing a REACH code or an ordinance, it's the local jurisdiction who has the authority to say what is cost effective. So they determine what's cost effective, and that is the case for all REACH codes. So why are they important? Well, frequently we hear, well, it's legally required, and then that's the end of the discussion. But actually, there's a few other reasons that the cost effectiveness studies are really important and needed when you're looking at different policy options. In addition to documenting that it meets the legal requirements, when we use prototype designs that are the same as used in the CEC standards, those designs are representative of that kind of building type, and so it establishes the boundaries of the performance requirements that you can set that can be applied widely. Okay. In addition to that, The cost effectiveness study shows that there's at least one pathway that meets the requirements. And although it's not technically required for amendments to the other parts of the building code or to an amendment to a municipal code, it's really important to understand the impacts of any kind of proposed change or policy in order to make an informed decision about how you're going to move forward. Okay. And also, in doing the study, we make sure that it's consistent with the state code, as I noted earlier. But in doing so, that actually informs new codes. And we could really see that in the 2019 cycle. A lot of the ordinances that were adopted over this cycle, the information from that really did feed into the 2022 adoption process and help move that forward. Okay, so I mentioned that the study satisfies the legal requirements. So I'm going to just review those really quickly. Karen just mentioned them. And we went through this in detail in session 1. So I'm going to stay fairly high level here. But it is important to be aware of them and how the cost effectiveness study satisfies these requirements. So there's the 3 legal requirements for energy reach codes that are over and above requirements for all the other amendments. Okay, the ordinance has to be cost effective, has to pay for itself over time. It also has to result in a reduction. The word that the CEC uses is diminution of energy use. So you have to actually be more stringent than the state code. You're not allowed to adopt an ordinance that's less stringent or results in a building using more energy use than the state code would allow. It has to be more stringent. And lastly, it cannot be preempted. This comes up a lot in reach codes, and we've talked about it before, but it bears repetition. The federal government regulates the efficiency of many appliances, including HVAC equipment and water heating equipment. State and local governments are not allowed to set different efficiency standards than the federal regulation. So essentially what that means is you are not allowed to mandate that people use high efficiency equipment. It can be an option, but it cannot be required. That requirement actually limits the kinds of measures that we're allowed to use in the cost effectiveness study. Because there has to be a compliance path that uses standard efficiency equipment. Even though using high efficiency equipment is one of the most common ways that people actually save energy and get compliance credit. We're not allowed to include that in the study. It can't be part of the mandate. So because of that, we have to select different and other non-preempted measures that we include in the analysis. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Okay, so how do you know if something's cost effective? There are a whole bunch of different metrics. These are probably the 3 very common metrics here. The first one is simple payback. Simple payback is very straightforward. It says, how long is it going to take me to recoup my investment? So for example, if you have an investment of $100 that saves $25 a year, your simple payback will be 4 years. It's a simple division. It's the first cost divided by the annual savings. It's very straightforward, but it offers a very limited perspective. It doesn't acknowledge the time value of money, nor does it capture any benefits that accrue after the measure pays back after those 4 years. So for example, if that measure actually lasted 8 years and continued to provide that $25 a year in savings, you would not see that in the simple payback. There's that $100 of benefits that would not be accounted for. So because of that, we look to a couple other metrics that are a little bit more comprehensive. That would be the benefit to cost ratio and the net present value. The benefit to cost ratio is probably one of the most common metrics. And actually in both cases, we're asking, do the benefits exceed the cost? Is this a cost-effective investment or requirement? For the benefit to cost ratio, the calculation is done by taking the net present value of the benefits and dividing that by the cost. If the benefits are greater than the cost, the result is greater than 1, it's a cost-effective. Looking at the net present value, that is asking at this time, do the benefits exceed the cost again? But the calculation actually takes the sum of the benefits, the net present value of the benefits, and we'll talk about that term in just a moment, and subtracts the cost from that. And if you come up with a positive value, then it's a cost-effective investment or requirement. So net present value, what does that mean? We talk about this a lot. The net present value is a way to look at an investment over time, and it actually converts the value to today's dollars. Essentially, we look at the money flow. It's either there's some payments over time, there's savings over time, and we look at that flow over time and convert that all to today's dollars. What would that investment or that flow of money be worth today? Because when we're looking out over a long period of time like that, it's pretty certain that $1 saved in 10 years is not likely to be worth the same as $1 today. So we need to convert that back to so that we have a consistent framework to look at. Okay. So I'm just going to break down the components of the calculation just a little bit further here. Okay. I'm going to start with the caveat that both benefits and costs can be both positive or negative numbers. There could be a measure that results in higher utility costs, even though we typically consider the utility savings as a benefit. We'd still keep it in the benefit part of the calc, but it would be a negative benefit, so it would actually subtract from the benefits. That same thing can happen in reverse on the cost side, and it does quite frequently. Okay, so these are typically how we consider these things, but note that they can be positive or negative. So the studies that we prepare document the cost effectiveness from two different perspectives, from the individual perspective as well as from a societal perspective. Okay. We call the individual perspective on bill, it's a shorthand. And basically that just means that we are actually taking the hourly energy use that results that come out of the software and applying that to the appropriate utility rate for whatever building type we're looking at. So we're actually using the utility bills, and we've come up with this on bill as the shorthand for that kind of a look. Utility rates vary across utilities. Utility rate structures vary as well, and many utilities are moving to a time of use rate structure, which charges more for electricity used during peak times. And we typically use a time of use structure, but it's not always required. And so we do talk with the individual utilities to get the rates. In addition to that, we also use the net energy metering tariff, the current tariff. Net energy metering, easy for me to say, right? Net energy metering, NEM for short, is actually the structure by which, if you have a PV system, it's the structure that you get credit for any additional energy use that you produce and send to the grid. And right now we're under the NEM 2.0 is how it's often referred to, rates, and the CPUC is in the process of examining those rates, and they are likely to change when they actually come out with a decision, and the change will probably update things. Those rates can really affect things. All of the changes in these rates can really affect the values, so it's important to keep an eye on them. Okay, and there's the last thing about energy rates is we also apply what we call an escalation rate. Now, the escalation rate is just an assumption about how much energy costs will rise over the cost of inflation in time. We use the rates that the CPUC has adopted recently. They adopted last year for that prediction, and that forecast goes out for 30 years, and each year there's a different rate. It's an annual choice. So it lets us know, given everything else being equal, the energy rates are actually, energy costs are going to probably go up more than inflation. They have historically, are likely to continue. Okay. So in contrast to the on-bill or the individual customer perspective, there's also a societal perspective that is the time-dependent valuation perspective, or TDV. TDV is, it uses TDV energy, and this is actually the code compliance metric. The the CEC uses TDV energy when they calculate cost effectiveness, as well as for documenting that every project meets the code requirements. TDV energy is actually a combination of energy and cost factors. And it places a very high value on peak energy use. So energy that is either used or saved at peak times is worth quite a bit more under TDV than energy that is used or saved during off-peak times. Those hourly factors actually include the cost of providing the service, as well as externalities, such as the greenhouse gas emissions. Also includes assumptions about methane and refrigerant leakage. And so they include, it's more of a wider view of the cost to provide that energy. Those costs are fixed based on the preset factors in the software. They vary every hour, but they're set for the time period. It doesn't matter which utility rate you use or if that changes. They are not impacted by that. They are fixed. Things tend to look more cost effective under that TDV perspective. The reason for that is we are taking a wider view. And that is a valid metric to use in determining cost effectiveness. It's often used typically more in new construction than in existing buildings. Typically, if you're doing an ordinance for an existing building, there's a little bit more focus on how that will impact the actual building owners and the person that pays the bill than there is on new construction. Okay, so we have two different views of the benefits. They either can be the benefits to the individual customer, what are the savings that they're going to see over time, or the benefits to all of us, to society. What's going to be the reduction in our cost to deliver this service? Okay. So let's look at costs. Generally, for most costs, they're identical under either scenario, except for the very first one that I'm going to point out here. That actually, relative to the mixed fuel base case, there's actually a cost savings or a negative cost for the all-electric design from not having to install that gas infrastructure, to bring that gas infrastructure to the site. And so we look at that savings, and that's actually a negative cost, still a cost, in the calculation. And under the current regulations, the individual developer pays approximately 50% of that cost, and the other 50% is recovered via the rate structure and paid by everybody. And so when we are looking at the on-bill or individual perspective, we use that 50% cost discount. For the TDV perspective, we use the full cost because the societal perspective does pay 100% of the infrastructure cost. We are paying for the full cost. Okay. So again, on-bill is what the individual person experiences, whereas TDV takes that wider view, reflecting that total cost. Okay. So in addition to that, there may be an incremental cost for the equipment purchase or installation. Those costs may include in-home infrastructure. So for example, if you're looking at a mixed fuel base case and your proposed ordinance is all electric, you would have to look at the infrastructure that is required. So you would save the piping for the gas, but you would have to possibly add other electric circuits and things like that. So we look at all that. We also look at the operation and maintenance costs and savings, as well as the equipment replacement cost. Oftentimes the equipment life is shorter than our analysis life cycle. So we often are looking at the replacement cost as well as the residual value. That residual value is the life left in the equipment at the end of the study. So there may be 5 more years of life left in that equipment, and it has a value, and we include that. Again, that's a negative cost. Lastly, for new construction, we assume that the cost is financed as part of the mortgage, and so that financing cost also goes into the equation. And our study timeframes are consistent with what the CEC uses, and that is a period of 30 years for residential occupancies and 15 years for non-residential occupancies. Okay, so that is a quick an introduction to the terms and the metrics we use. And so now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Chris Reed and to Greg Mahoney to talk about how some of these metrics translate when you're actually working with stakeholders. It's one thing to see them on paper, but it changes a little bit when you're working with stakeholders. Go ahead, Chris.
Great, thanks, Misty. So I can go to the next slide, actually. So my name is Chris Reed. I'm the Sustainability Manager at the City of San Luis Obispo. And in 2019, we were one of the first cities to pass an electric preferred REACH code. We then readopted in 2020 with some amendments. We're working on an update now. So we've been really in the thick of this particular technical question for a long time. I wanted to talk a little bit today about a step beyond cost effectiveness from the sort of legal perspective for what satisfies a self-determined cost effectiveness declaration for CEC approval, et cetera. And really talk a little bit about how community members in our outreach processes have engaged with this concept. You know, when you look at the cost effectiveness study, it looks at benefits and costs at a whole system level, which is appropriate for complicated policy decisions. But what it doesn't always do is then ask benefits and costs for who and when. And so I just wanted to talk through, having no real experience in building development myself up until 3 or 4 years ago, coming into this space and not fully appreciating the life of a building from vacant land with some ideas and some financing lined up to ultimately an occupied building, talking through how each of those parties experience these costs and benefits. Also just really emphasize that our policy is only focused on new buildings, and to Misty's point earlier, as we're getting into existing buildings, all of this is substantially more complicated. But yeah, so I just wanted to talk through a couple of key parties in the transaction and the building of a building. So there's the landholder, there's the developer, there's the builder, there's other parties in this space, but just think, you know, you have a piece of land, you want to do something with it, right? When we think about a policy that affects the energy systems on the building that will go on that land, we really are thinking of sort of 3 variables. There's the time cost. So if someone's sitting on land and they want to build, they're not holding the land intentionally, but they actively want to build. The longer it takes to build that building, the worse their cash flow looks, right? And so if they have to wait for 2 different sets of reviews of utility system designs, they have to work with 2 different utilities for approvals, et cetera, that can increase time, which can increase holding costs. There's the offsite capital, so there's the cost that developers and builders need to invest in infrastructure that's outside of the parcel that they're building. So that includes, on the electrical side, potential substation or other electrical system capacity upgrades. And on the natural gas side, it means extending main branch lines and then actually bringing that infrastructure on site. Then, of course, there's the on-site capital. So there's the in-building infrastructure, there's the connections, there's the laterals, there's all the things they need to pay to actually build the buildings. So, you know, when we talk about cost effectiveness at the system level, we're often talking, many of the savings and costs on the construction side happen in this category of participants. You know, once the building's built, it gets transferred to the owner. The costs and benefits those folks experience are now operational in nature. So if they are paying the power bills, it's the on-bill piece of this, the cost for the electricity or the cost for electricity and natural gas. There's the O&M, so it's the cost to maintain the appliances and electrical and mechanical systems on site. And there's the replacement capital needed as appliances burn out. Finally, there's the tenant. This is where a non-owner tenant is in place, think small commercial or housing, where they're typically only exposed to the end here, the operational cost, the on-bill piece, the utility bill piece. The important finding for us was that the costs or benefits, either that impact or are benefited to the developer builder, may or may not pass on to the cost of the building, which impacts the owner, which may or may not be passed to the building tenant, which can impact or benefit the tenant. We still, in our work, use cost effectiveness through the cost effectiveness studies as the overall findings relative to the cost effectiveness of our policy for decision making, for our council to make informed policy decisions. But it's really powerful to be able to talk to a developer and builder and say, we understand the different costs and benefits that you, or different costs and potential benefits you might experience in this, and really speak directly to that, to owners, to tenants, et cetera. And then, of course, there's the common denominator at the bottom, which is society. And this is where the TDV, societal benefit, gets in on the cost effectiveness study. But there are costs and benefits that our entire community accrue for installing infrastructure that will be obsolete in a decade, for installing on-site appliances that will have to be replaced at cost to our entire community. And so that's one last stakeholder. And this is where the advocates and opponents that don't have a stake in new buildings necessarily, but are interested in larger utility systems or climate issues are really engaged. And so that's an important piece to talk about there. I'm going to put a link to our staff report from 2019 that sort of breaks apart each of these and gives some estimates on how typical developers, builders, how typical building owners, how typical tenants will experience the costs and benefits of the policy we're proposing. But being able to speak at this granularity was really powerful for us, and I think helped us work with our community to identify a policy path forward in a way that has allowed us to be really successful. So happy to answer questions about that, and thanks for the chance to speak this morning.
Thank you very much, Chris. I really appreciate that. And I think even if you don't understand, say, a developer's entire cost picture, it's important and valuable to let them know that you do understand that it may be different than what you're looking at from this study. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Greg, and he's going to talk a little bit more about managing expectations.
All right, thank you, Misty. If you want to go to the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I approach REACH codes and specifically cost effectiveness, and how I use those cost effectiveness studies to manage expectations of all the different stakeholders involved. I worked for the City of Davis for 14 years, and when I first started back in 2006, I was assigned 2 tasks. One was to become an energy efficiency expert, which I hadn't been, and it's much easier said than done. And the second was to look into a green building ordinance. I didn't know anything about green building at the time, but those were my assignments. So at the time, 2006, 2007, there are only a few jurisdictions that had adopted green building ordinances in the Bay Area. And I was fortunate to meet a man named Peter Bruck, who was a building official of Roanoke Park, and he had written his master's thesis on developing a green building ordinance. And fortunately for me, he was willing to share that information. And the information he provided me was just invaluable in my efforts to work on a green building ordinance. And this was back in 2008, 3 years before CalGreen was adopted by the state. And so I based we went forward with the green building ordinance. The residential was based on Build It Green checklist and program, and the non-res on LEED checklist. And the ordinance included a 15% compliance margin. And so in that process of developing the ordinance, I learned that per the Warren-Alquist Act, you had to demonstrate cost effectiveness. And I can remember sitting in a conference room with the building official and the community development director and the city attorney, communicating that we need to, in order to move forward with this, we need a cost effectiveness study. And the city attorney said that no one in Davis is going to challenge the ordinance. Everyone's progressive here. And she was correct until she wasn't. And so coincidentally, I was on the phone one day with Misty, and she informed me that in a energy consultant meeting that day, my name had come up, and my name came up because I had not gone through the entire process of demonstrating cost effectiveness, getting approval from the California Energy Commission, and going through the whole process. And the designer had checked the Energy Commission's website, saw that City of Davis didn't have an ordinance that had been approved by the CEC, so he wanted to let me know that he didn't have to comply with our ordinance, and yeah, I agreed. And so anyway, lesson learned on that one, and through I actually wrote several green building ordinances without the cost effectiveness study, and the Energy Commission was kind of gently trying to prod me to get compliant and not going rogue. But anyway, eventually we got on track, and so I just want to talk a little bit about the process of moving a REACH code forward and the role that cost effectiveness plays in that process. So when you're going through that process of developing a REACH code, there are a number of stakeholders you're required to engage with during that process, and they'll have different expectations, different motivations for being involved. You know, some of the most passionate are the citizen activists or environmentalists, and they're typically looking for carbon neutrality or zero net energy, and you know, like I said, they're very passionate, and the cost effectiveness study kind of allows you or gives you a credible defense, you know, that balances expectations or balances the different things that drive the stakeholders. So in Davis, you know, normally what the role that I played, because it is a progressive community, was to kind of put on the brakes and say, hey, we can only go this far. This is what the law allows. We have to demonstrate cost effectiveness, and we can't require anything beyond that. And so it kind of gives you a place where you can, a credible place where you can say, this is as far as we want to go as far as we can, and this is as far as we can go. And, you know, as technology improves and things like that, you know, we'll be able to get farther, but this is as far as we can go. And conversely, with developers and contractors, you know, they're trying to make a living. They're doing this, you know, for monetary reasons, and they already consider the process to be lengthy, very expensive, adds cost to the project. You know, there are different requirements and limitations that they have to deal with. And for them, many of them feel that it's unreasonable for new construction to bear these, the brunt of climate change. And they often point to, you know, the existing housing stock or the existing building stock to be the ones that are really contributing more to climate change, and that we can't, you know, change that just by regulating new construction. And, you know, that they're correct that the existing buildings do play a big role in CO2 and greenhouse gases and things like that. So, but these are the arguments that the developers will bring forward, and we can say that, well, you know, we're not trying to go any farther than what's considered cost effective. So again, it gives you that position that you can take with both sides. You know, the activists and the developers, they're at opposite ends of the spectrum, and it kind of gives you that you know, credible balancing point. Elected bodies, they also, you know, lean on or you can present the cost effectiveness study to them, and it gives them you know, a way to, I guess, land on whatever their decision is. And elected bodies, the people who are part of the elected body, they could be pro-business, they could be more progressive and environmentalist at heart. And so the pro-business representatives, they really need some compelling information to side with the ordinance. And the way we do that is say, this is, you know, we're not going any farther than the law allows. We're just, these are cost-effective measures, and they are, you know, there is benefit. And some of the more progressive elected bodies or members of the elected body, you know, would like to go farther, you know, with the ordinance. under consideration, but this is a way to kind of, like I said, put the brakes on and say, this is as far as we can go. So it really does provide a defensible balance between all the different stakeholders. And it gives, for the electeds, it gives them a place to hang their hat on without offending their constituency. And like I said, Davis is a very different kind of community, I think, than a lot where I really, it was easy for me to move reach codes forward. It's really what I had to do was kind of slow people down. And not that we want to do that, but that's what the law requires. And so when you're doing outreach to the public, it allows you to speak to each side as though this is a reasonable option for them. You know, the developer or contractor is obviously going to argue that it's not a cost effective for them because the cost savings is realized by the building owner, not the developer. And if you're talking to a new home developer, you know, they probably will use the added energy efficiency as a marketing tool, but I would advise against using that as an argument for the developer. They probably don't want to or won't appreciate a government employee weighing in on marketing strategy. And like I said, they will typically argue that existing housing stock is where we really need to focus our attention. But anyway, this cost effectiveness study is a very useful tool. Can we go to the next slide, please, Misty? And so how deep do we go? And when I talk about how deep do we go, I'm talking about detail in the staff report and in your presentation. And it really depends on how comfortable you are with the information that you're presenting. My approach has always been to keep it simple, keep it as simple as I can, and really try to leave all the detail in the study. We just heard Misty and Chris talk about the level of detail that is included in these studies. And me personally, I don't want to try to explain all that very specific detail, not only to the elected bodies who may have little or no experience in energy efficiency, or you know the other stakeholders. So I really try to keep the detail in the study. I provide enough material to make the case for the REACH code. I really think that the more detail that you provide, the more opportunity for questions and critique from, you know, the audience or from the council or board of supervisors. The council members or board of supervisors who present themselves as pro-business will generally feel the need to question the ordinance to show that they're representing their constituents. And like I say, the more details you provide, the more opportunity for questions. And so, if you're presenting tables or presenting information in your presentation or in the staff report, it's really important to understand the data and tables that are included in that presentation so that you can explain anything that you presented or put before them. And so I often, you know, kind of stress the fact that we have to demonstrate compliance with the Warren Outpost Act. That's why we have the cost effectiveness study, and communicate to the stakeholders and elected body that it provides a level of, you know, credibility to your presentation. And one thing that is very important when you're doing these presentations to the board or the council is you really need to understand the components of the study and some of these things that Misty was talking about, TDV, understand what that is, CO2 savings. For many, you know, jurisdictions, it's going to be important to see what the CO2 savings or the CO2 savings associated with this ordinance are, or what will be realized. I personally, and these are my opinions, I'm not saying this the way that you need to do it, but this is, I've been writing REACH codes since 2006, so I've presented quite a few of them. I don't really focus on CO2 savings, although I do provide that information because it seems like it's rather nebulous to me, and I'm not sure that it should be a metric that we use in the code, but it's one that people recognize and is important. If you're not comfortable with the information that you're providing, it's probably a good idea to bring someone who is knowledgeable, who can answer, you know, some of the more difficult questions. I think it's important to understand the prototype buildings that are used in the software, so you can explain that to the decision makers. Approximate cost of the measures above minimum code, that's always going to be a question that they're going to want to know, well, how much is this costing up front? And so that kind of information is important. There's one question that I've been asked every time I bring a reach code forward, and that is about the compliance margin, and what exactly is a compliance margin. So definitely want to understand that. You want to know what HERS is, the EDR scale, difference between efficiency EDR and total EDR. All those things, just want to be prepared to answer the questions that will arise about your staff report or your presentation. Just don't put information in there that you don't feel comfortable responding to, or that you don't feel comfortable answering questions about. And if we could just go to the last slide. I just put all this information in here because it provides kind of a graphic illustration of the tables and information, or what it may look like to someone who's not experienced with these types of studies or is not knowledgeable about energy efficiency metrics. And as I said, if you're going to present this information, you're going to present these tables, it's really important that you understand what you're presenting so that you can answer any questions that may arise about energy efficiency, especially for someone who isn't familiar with. There are many terms that we use, on a daily basis that we understand. We have deep understanding of it, but someone who's not involved in energy efficiency may not. So it's one thing to understand, being able to explain it to someone who's not familiar with it. It's a little more challenging. So like I said, just do your homework. Don't put a lot of detail and information in your staff report that you may struggle explaining. And just be prepared and be ready to answer questions, and to be ready to answer questions from both sides. And like I said, the cost effectiveness study really is an effective tool to manage and respond to expectations from all the stakeholders. And I think that's about all I have. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to respond.
Thank you very much, Greg and Chris. Just wanted to say, I did not stop for questions earlier. We have Chris has to get out of here in about 5 minutes. So if you have any questions, if you could direct them for Chris first, that would be fabulous. And then we can take questions.
There was. Tom, did you have a question? I saw a hand raised, but I think down.
Actually, kind of more of a comment and question. It was, just seeing the complexity of things like the EDR rating and that type of approach when using an electric preferred reach code as opposed to an all electric reach code. One of the simple ways cities can go forward is to pick the path of an all electric reach code where they don't have to have their inspectors and staff counting EDR on projects as they implement things. They just need to look to whether the device is powered by wires or pipes.
It's probably just a little bit more complicated than that because there are efficiencies involved as well.
Indeed, that is an option, and there's also an option that could combine an all-electric mandate with a reach code that also requires that we maintain the efficiency level we had in the 2019 standards. So there's a lot of different possibilities there. Indeed. Any other questions for Chris or Greg? Frank?
Can you hear me okay? Okay, yes. My question is for Chris. So when San Luis Obispo have this reach code for all electrification, right, requirement, did you require the new restaurant buildings to comply that requirement? And how you convince the restaurant owner, the equipment with the electricity will be cooked at the same level for cuisine as the gas burner, whatever. That's typical obstacles I heard. Yeah. If you can share something, Chris, that'd be great.
Sure. Thanks, Frank. It's a really good question. And I think, as local government staff work on their REACH codes, I think it's really important to understand what buildings are in the pipeline. Often you can work with your community development department to get a sense with pretty high levels of certainty what's going to be built in the next 3 years, and think about in that group of buildings that we expect to see coming through the permit counter, what end uses are particularly hard to electrify or may cause challenges for compliance with increased efficiency or building performance standards? And are there a narrow set of exemptions to make sure that the city is achieving its other goals around economic development or housing, et cetera? There might be light industrial uses that have no ability for electrification in the near term future that you want to allow gas piping to continue to go to support for many reasons. And then on the other hand, you may have restaurants that are claiming that there's no electrification alternatives, that there clearly are and they're cost effective, et cetera. In which case that's just a local conversation that needs to be had. In the 2019 code, we ended up saying, I'm trying to recall exactly, I believe we said restaurant cooking equipment and dishwashing equipment could be mixed fuel, and but it had to be limited specifically to that space and could not allow, like in a mixed use development or in a multi-tenant development, was not justification to run gas piping to other places if you went with the all electric compliance pathway. I think as we're looking forward to an all electric requirement similar to Santa Barbara and Santa Cruz, I think maybe the easier path and the more elegant path is sort of a public goods or public benefit exemption, where there has to be some overwhelming case for why a use needs to be gas that has some pathway for approvals, either administratively or through an advisory body. And I think that might be the way we move forward next time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
And I think you bring up a really good point, Frank. That's the area that is always the most difficult, especially with single family dwellings, that people don't really care how their house is heated or how their water is heated, but they really seem attached to the cooking over flame and having gas fireplaces. And that's the difficult part. But I'm an induction stovetop, and I've had gas cooking, and induction stovetops I think are far superior. People just need to get to know them and get to know that technology. You have much more control, more so than gas, even though most people believe that gas is preferred because of the control. But anyway, I guess it's just getting people to use and getting familiar with new technology.
A lot of education required. Chris, I'm going to just interrupt here and let you get off the phone here, because I know you have about 5 minutes before your next one. Thank you for staying, and thank you for your presentation. Thank you. Okay. Any other questions for Greg or myself before we move on to the next section here? Frank, did you have another question?
No, sorry, I forgot. I forgot to lower my head.
Okay.
Right.
Thanks.
My bad. Thanks.
No worries. Okay. All right. Well, let's go ahead and move forward. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the actual study itself now, and kind of some of the elements that go into the study. So, was somebody trying to say something? No. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. So when we start a study, one of the first steps is to determine what is the baseline. What are we going to compare to? And for new construction, we typically use the state standards as the baseline, the minimum state requirements. And we also use the same building designs as the CEC, the CEC uses for the state code. and as well as the compliance software, CBEC and CBEC Res software, to run it through the software model and figure out what our compliance margins are. Once we do that, we start identifying potential measures and opportunities for exceeding the code. We start looking at various measures. We collect some cost data. We begin developing the model, and we simulate each measure. Okay, and once we then have the energy savings and the cost for each measure, the compliance software actually produces hourly results, and we get both the site energy and the TDV energy use. And so we look at both, and we evaluate those costs and the savings to start developing packages of measures. And that's an iterative process that we go through, where we put together a package, we look at the cost, and we try to optimize both the cost and the savings so that we get to a good package that defines kind of the outer boundary, as Greg was noting, of where you can set the policy limits. Okay. The packages, sometimes, one of the things to note is that we sometimes combine measures. So a package may include measures that aren't cost effective, and not every single measure has to be cost effective. The policy overall has to be cost effective. One of the common ones that we typically include is battery storage. Oftentimes the battery storage isn't cost effective on its own, but when paired with a PV system, the two together are cost effective. The PV at this time is very cost effective and is able to kind of buy down the battery, so to speak. Once we find those packages, we then start looking at the compliance margin. We quantify that. What is the compliance margin and which metric are we going to target? The code and dealing with the code, the EDR, the different things like compliance margin is kind of a different topic here. It's really important to know what you're asking of people, but we're not going to get into that today. But it is something that's going to come up. And so I just want to encourage folks to take a look at that and try to become a little bit familiar with those metrics as you go forward, because you will see them.
Misty, before you
yes.
go further, Greg had mentioned the importance of compliance margins, and you just mentioned them as well. Can you explain just what exactly a compliance margin is and what you mean by that term?
Absolutely. Thank you, Karen. A compliance margin is basically the amount of, the magnitude of the proposed project, how much it exceeds the minimum requirement is really what we're looking at. So if we say that to achieve CEC state level compliance, you must, I'm sorry, I'm going to back up. The state compliance is typically done on a performance basis. So they set what we call an energy budget. It's a TDV, energy budget. And the proposed buildings are not allowed to use more than that budget. And so the compliance margin, if we're looking at it from a budget perspective, represents that amount of money that you have left over at the end of the month that you can then go into savings or, for your entertainment or something like that, other discretionary funds. It is that difference between the minimum requirement and the actual performance of the project. It can be expressed in different ways. Oftentimes for non-residential projects, we express it as a percentage. So an ordinance might require that an office building performs 10% better than the state standards. And that 10% is the margin we're looking for. That number is actually right on the compliance documentation. It's not something that has to be calculated outside. It's right on the main page of the compliance documentation, as is the EDR margin. So those aren't calculated. The EDR is the energy design rating, and it's used for residential projects. It's a number without a unit. It's unitless. And the margin is really just a reduction in that value. So again, it's that percentage above and beyond the minimum. TDV, I see a question in the chat here. TDV is time-dependent valuation, and it is the compliance metric that the CEC uses. Essentially, it values energy that is used or saved on peak more highly than it values energy used or saved off peak. and provides a societal perspective for cost effectiveness as well as compliance. Okay. Okay, so just a little bit more about the packages that we develop and how we do that. When we're developing the packages, our main objective, of course, is to maximize the energy and greenhouse gas emissions savings and to stay cost effective, but we also balance some other considerations here. One of the things that we look at is that achieving this kind of savings is actually pretty easy on paper, much easier than it is in real life. There are physical logistics that sometimes make it much more challenging. And so we try to keep our studies fairly conservative to allow a little bit of room there. They tend to be also, well, excuse me, what they're not intended to be is an example of the best design practices. Our studies are intended, the main intention is to fulfill a legal requirement. They're not that example of the best design. Because of preemption, we're limited in the measures we can choose. We're using a prototypical design, so one could certainly make a building that's designed better in the first place and then improve it along the way. So there's a lot of ways to get more savings with design and equipment selection. So it's something to keep in mind is that the measure packages that we wind up with are intended for that legal requirement of being cost effective and saving as much energy as we can and reducing emissions. So just keep that in mind, that the objective is a little bit different than if you were looking at how to design the best building. One of the last things here is that the models are representative. The building types that we select tend to represent a majority of the buildings that are being constructed. For example, in multifamily, we've selected the two different building prototypes that represent most of the new construction in that area now. But just keep in mind that it's not going to cover every situation. No matter what we select, there will always be something else out there that may or may not be covered. So just know that these are meant to be a representative sample. Okay, just look at, this is a list of the different packages that we are including in the 2022 single family analysis. Okay, so we start with a base case. And that base case in 2022 assumes that the design is mixed fuel with a heat pump water heater in most climate zones. In climate zones 3, 4, 13, and 14, it assumes the space heating is a heat pump and the water heating is gas fueled. But in all the other climate zones, it's heat pump water heater, space heating is gas, cooking and clothes drying. All three of those are gas. So all of the designs are compared to that base case. We have just one. We used to have two in 2019. Now there's one. All electric designs, we've looked at 3 different options. There is an efficiency plus PV and storage. That is basically taking it to its outer limit. How far can we go here? How much of a margin can we achieve? How much beyond the state requirement can we go? There's also a measure that just has efficiency, or a package that just has efficiency measures, as well as a package that simply requires electric construction. That is a minimally compliant all electric, so it just barely complies. No real reach there. On the mixed fuel side, we have 2 designs. We have the Efficiency Plus, which is similar to the first design on the all electric side, increased efficiency, additional PV and battery storage. Again, going kind of to the outer edge of where we can get cost effectively. And then an efficiency only package that just shows increased efficiency measures. So you can see this gives you an idea of various points in the process where you may be able to set policy. We try to take it out to the furthest we can, with the knowledge that if you do not want to be as aggressive, if you want to select something that is maybe only halfway there, that will also be cost effective. So it gives you a range within which you can design your policy. For single family, we also include an extra run, an extra package that is just there for information only. It's actually a preempted package of measures. What we know is that most often builders and homeowners will use high efficiency equipment to save energy and to exceed compliance, to get that compliance credit. And so we do a package that shows the prototype design with that high efficiency equipment so that you can see what a package most likely would look like. What is the cost effectiveness most likely going to look like? Because it's not likely going to look like the package we selected, as I noted. We're unable to select those very common techniques, and so it makes the package look a little bit strange. So we also include this one. I do want to say again, it is preempted. You are not allowed to require this. You may not mandate that anybody use high efficiency equipment. It can be an option. However, if that's an option, you also have to have an option that includes standard efficiency equipment. There has to be that option no matter what else is in the ordinance. So just keep that in mind. So these are the packages that we're going to be looking at. We're going to be releasing the draft results here in about a month. So these will be coming out soon. Okay. Oops, sorry, went the wrong way. So as Greg noted, the studies are full of a bunch of different tables. As you saw, there's graphs, there's tables, there's pictures, there's descriptions of methodology, there's all kinds of things in the studies. And I strongly encourage you to read the studies at least once. Read them through. Go through them. Even if there's parts of it you don't get or things like that, it's really important to really familiarize yourself with how the studies are put together. There's a lot more detail in the study than we're able to cover here about some of these assumptions and the way we put things together. Okay, and so we're aware that using the studies it can be really, really challenging to pull the results for a particular city from the reports, especially if you're a city with multiple climate zones. We often think that that is really the exception to the rule, and while it's not the most common, there are about 20% of the cities across the state that actually have multiple climate zones within their jurisdiction. And so it makes it really difficult to find the exact numbers that you need to put together a staff report. So we started developing the Cost Effectiveness Explorer, and it is a tool to help facilitate you using and understanding the results. Makes it much easier to see the impacts of various policy decisions for your jurisdiction specifically. Okay, so this is actually a picture of the results page we can see this for Marin County, and it was the single family new construction study from 2019. We're working on the new one now, so we don't have those results, but they'll look fairly similar. Basically, what you can see here is that Marin County has 2 climate zones. So in the Explorer, you can just click the other one and switch back and forth. If you're trying to use the study, it's pulling the numbers from multiple tables. So this makes it a little bit easier. And when we display the results, what we're looking at are the results per home. So these are the results on a building level. Okay. And if we look down the left side, you can see these are the list of packages that we studied. Is very similar, not exactly the same, but similar to the ones we just went through for 2022. And then you can see the 2 perspectives in cost effectiveness that we were discussing. You can also display the simple payback if you like. There's a feature over here where you can add columns, but I do not have it showing here, so I could show some other things on the screen. But you can see how how you can easily compare from the individual's perspective, what's the most cost-effective choice, and from society's perspective, and how do they compare to each other. I mentioned earlier that the benefit to cost ratio can be a little bit problematic in some situations, and this is one of them. And what you see here is an infinity sign for this electrification plus PV neutral cost scenario that we modeled. The reason for that is that we purposely modeled it so there would be 0 incremental cost. If you remember, our equation has the benefits to cost ratio, which means there's a 0 on the bottom. So we come up with something undefined. And then the second problem is that this is very, very cost effective. If there's no incremental cost and you get a stream of savings over time, that's a very cost effective measure. It's actually infinitely cost effective. It becomes cost effective the moment you start operations, right? And so the benefit to cost ratio just doesn't give us a good way to express that. And so it really is a lot easier to see the net present value. And then you can look and you'll see a number that says, oh, this is worth about $10,000 to me over the lifetime of this building. Okay, so that's when this is one of those situations where that can be a little bit problematic. Okay, so moving over towards the right here.
Quick question, Misty.
Yes.
Question in the chat. Does the tool allow choosing multiple cities or counties?
Not at one time. No. You can switch, but you can only look at one at a time.
But the results would be the same if a city is in the same climate zone as like if someone wants to look at a geographic area, if it's all within the same climate zone, the results would be the same for those cities. Is that right? Correct?
Generally speaking, yes. Most often that is the truth. At this level, the per home or per building results, depending on what kind of building you're looking at, would be the same in most cases. There are some cases, for example, in SMUD's territory, where we do use the SMUD values for SMUD's territory, but there's other areas in climate zone 12 that are not served by SMUD, and those have different numbers. So there are some cases where they vary, but generally speaking, across the climate zone, you get the same results at the per building level. When you start looking ahead, in our next slide, we'll see that things would be different there. So what you can see here, though, is you have the emission savings, the incremental cost of each measure, the bill savings, and in this case, the compliance margin. You can, again, add or hide any of these columns. There's other choices that you could display. There's energy savings and other things that you may want to look at. But by putting them in a table this way, it's very easy to see not just these savings that you're going to get, but what kind of an ask is this? How much of an ask? Are you asking people to invest $10,000, $15,000, or in this case, we have a slight savings up front. Also gives you an idea of what the bill savings might look like. And so it gives you a real good way to compare different selections. Also provides a city or county-wide view of the savings over time. The categories here at the top are pretty much the same as what we were looking at on the per home view. But what's a little bit different here is that we are, for the 2022, we're adding these in right now. This is in development, so I can't quite show you yet. But we will have new construction forecasts included for each city. They'll be defaulted with the best of our knowledge based on data that's available, but you will have an opportunity to actually change that data and enter whatever data you have if you have more accurate information. As Chris was saying, you can talk with your planning department and things like that and often find out about how many new homes you anticipate over the next few years. And so you can customize that and then get a look at what this looks like to the whole community. What are the, touched my wheel. What are the emission savings community-wide? How much is it going to cost? What are our benefits? In this case, you can see the benefits are almost twice the cost in this scenario. And so you can also customize this based on the share of clean electricity that you have now. If you have a particular target date in your jurisdiction where you're going to be at 100% clean electricity, you can modify that. We have a whole bunch of things that you can modify. If you can modify the default assumptions that we've made to more closely reflect the situation in your jurisdiction. You can access the studies and the Explorer at localenergycodes.com. You can all do everything via the menu, of course, but you can also just go to our homepage, scroll down a bit, and type in the name of your city or county, and it'll take you right there, and you'll see some results right off the bat. circling back a little bit, I know we've given you just a ton of information. It's a lot of just data points, it seems like, I know. And so there's just a few key pieces that you want to keep in mind for all these studies. It's really kind of three things. We want to know what's the requirement, what are the results of this policy, and how is it going to impact individuals and us as a community. So you want to know, what are we asking people to do? How much of a compliance margin are we asking them to achieve? How much do they have to go beyond the state requirements? And what are the outcomes? Well, what are we going to get from it? What will be the results, both in energy savings and emission reductions? And lastly, what's it going to cost? And what are the savings? Is this going to be cost effective for the individuals and for the community? One or the other, perhaps? What are we doing here, and what are we going to be impacting? So there's really just those three big categories of results. And these are very similar to the list, as you note, that Greg had pointed out earlier too. So I do encourage you, I know that it seems like at first a lot of these things do not connect very well, but as you read the reports and start working with the numbers, they do begin to connect. And I actually forgot to mention one thing on the previous slide. I'm going to go back just a couple slides here really quickly. One of the features that is actually one of my favorite features in the Explorer is this little eye up here by single family homes. There's a little eye in a blue circle. Nearly every field has that. And it actually is connected directly to the study. It pulls up a two-level bit of information about that field. And so you get just a short explanation or a much longer detailed explanation for basically anything in here. So if you read the study, get a kind of a big picture, and then start working with the data, you'll be able to look things up in context here as you're working with them and get the answer to a very specific question pretty easily. So it really does make working with the information much easier. Okay. So again, really just need to know the requirement, the results, and the impacts, and a lot of detail in between. Okay. So for the 2022 code cycle, we've got a series of studies coming up for newly constructed buildings. We have single family and ADUs, multifamily and non-residential, several occupancy types. We'll be updating our existing building studies for residential for additions and alterations. And we just started a new study on electric pool and spa heating. And so that is, it's a little bit behind the new construction studies, but we are working on that as well. Okay. And lastly, getting from a study to the ordinance, again, I strongly recommend you use the Explorer to help you compare, to look at the different options for your jurisdiction, compare and contrast how those might work out. You can also download model ordinance language there and other collateral materials, some checklists and other things like that. And we'll talk a little bit more about those specifics on April 26th. Okay. And I think that pretty much does it. Any questions?
We have about 5 minutes for questions. So if anybody, this is your opportunity. Any questions about anything that Misty's talked about or anything that you've encountered relative to reach codes and cost effectiveness in particular, yeah, raise those hands. I see a couple hands raised. Let's go with Brianne. Brianne, can you unmute yourself?
Maybe we'll come back to Brianne.
All right, let's come back. Wait, okay, let's come back to Brianne. Yeah, exactly. Sarah Sherborne, do you have a question? Can you?
Yeah. Hi, Misty. Thank you. That was really helpful presentation. I'm wondering for the cost side of things, when you all are calculating labor and installation costs and those kinds of things, how granular that is geographically, if you're looking at kind of local contractor rates, or how specific that gets to the communities that you're doing these analyses for.
It doesn't quite get to the community level.
Okay.
It's not, yeah, it's not, generally it's basically statewide. On the non-res side, there are some adjustments regionally, but not nearly down to the community level. It's more like a regional adjustment that they make.
Okay, so mostly those assumptions would be the same for the entire state based on an average of what those labor costs are?
Essentially, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and Brienne noted that her microphone wasn't working, so she's typed her question into the chat. And her question is, when would a jurisdiction need to conduct their own cost effectiveness studies versus using a statewide one? And before Misty answers that, I'll just mention that the statewide cost effectiveness studies that Misty's team prepared are a resource. They're free for everyone to use, but there's no requirement to use them. You can hire your own consultant, or if you have staffs that are up to it, you can come up with your own cost effectiveness study. Just the local government, each jurisdiction needs to decide, what their basis for making the decision that something is cost effective on. But obviously, Misty's team has put a lot of effort into this, and they're free. So those are a couple good reasons. But so Misty, when would a jurisdiction need to conduct their own cost effectiveness study?
We do. We have actually also worked with several jurisdictions to develop the packages that folks have asked for. So we are trying to connect with everybody. The only time you'd really need to do your own is if you really want to do something that is very different and not contained in the cost effectiveness study. And it's not something that we're able to do for you for free. Oftentimes we work based on request. And if we get a request from enough cities and we're able to leverage that request, leverage the funding for multiple cities to use, we can add studies. Like that's what we did with the electric pool and spa heating. But if you wanted to do something very specific that really just isn't covered at all in any of the studies, you're the only one that's interested in it, then that would probably be the only time I would recommend doing your own. If you can use the cost effectiveness study that is provided and already paid for, there's a lot of different possibilities with that study. It looks like there's just a few packages, but there's also all the room within each one of those. Those are the outside boundaries. And so there's a lot of different possibilities there. The other thing I would say is also to, if you do have something or you're looking for something different, give me a call, contact us. We may be able to help you with that. It may be something that's incremental to what we've done already instead of starting a whole new study. So check with us first is what I would say.
All right, we have one more question, one more person with the hand raised, Tom Cabot. And then there's a couple questions in the chat. We'll see if we have time to get to those as well. Go ahead, Tom.
Misty, thanks for putting up the slide that showed all the different cases you were looking at in single family residential. There was one that confused me, though. It was in the mixed fuel column to the right, and it was additional efficiency. And what I was thinking was that the base code had already incorporated all the cost-effective efficiency. And so I didn't know, is that not true? And there is room for additional efficiency that is still cost effective beyond the base code in mixed fuel?
There still is room in mixed fuel. We are able to add several measures. The room is getting less and less, but we haven't quite maxed it out yet. So there is still a little bit of room. I can send you, if you'd like, I can send the list of measures that we used for the package, if you like, Tom.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of quick questions from the chat. One is, did you say when the cost effectiveness study will be ready for single family homes?
I sort of did. What I did say is that the results will be ready. We will be having a webinar with draft results. They're fairly solid, but the compliance software for 2022 has not been certified yet. It's not final. So we can't say that these are final results. We believe they are, and they're likely to not, if they change, we think it'll be small. But we are what we'll be doing is doing a webinar where we release the results from the analysis so that you can get started on your outreach and doing your own analyses while we complete the report. The report tends to take a little bit longer to finish up, so we try to get the results out there first. So we'll be having a webinar. Invitations are just about to go out on May 3rd for single family and May 11th for non-residential. So
Great. A couple more questions. One, the incremental cost seem low. What year is it based on? And are they updated for actual construction escalation?
Depends on which costs you're talking about. They are current. These are actually from 2019, so they were done in 2018 and 2019. So they may be a little bit low for our current situation. They are being updated for the 2022 studies. We don't have those completed yet, and so they are being updated now. And they are not updated annually, though. We typically do that once for the 3-year cycle.
I'll mention too that it caught me a couple times because it's incremental cost. So it's not the total cost of a measure. It's the difference between what it would cost for the base technology and the measure. So trying to think of an example, but you know, if you're talking about like a gas water heater versus a heat pump water heater, then like it's not the cost of a heat pump water heater, it's the cost of a heat pump water heater minus the cost of a gas water heater.
Exactly.
So that catches people sometimes. And then last question before we wrap up is electric vehicle charging included in any of the models?
Not at this time, no. We all see the writing on the wall, and it will at some point have to be included as part of the building, I think, but not yet.
All right. So we'll wrap that up. And just a couple last key points and takeaways. This is obviously very complicated. There's a lot of stuff here, but people have done this before, and you're not alone. We're here to help. Misty is great at explaining things and taking time and answering questions, and her team also. And you know, Bayron is also glad to help for the folks in our area. And a lot of times you can work with your peers, folks like Chris and Greg and others in your area who you know, have done this before or who might be working on it at the same time. So you know, it's doable. Cities have done it. You'll be able to do it if that's the way you want to go, and you can get help. Those are the key points. We wanted to make it a point, even though it is confusing. So this is the third of our webinar series. We have our next one in April. We're going to talk about some REACH code ordinance options. Trying to figure out how to fit that all into 90 minutes right now. And then we'll take a bit of a break and talk about implementation. Come back in September for that, when folks will have hopefully gone a few steps further and be ready to think about, all right, so if you've got a REACH code in process or adopted, how do you make it actually happen? How do you actually implement it? So those two coming up. And we've put in some resources for you, contact information, and that is it. It's 11:30, and thank you all so much for coming today. Really appreciate that.
Thank you.